Hey guys, so we're going to move on to the next set of notes, lesson 1.4, and this is dealing with the word problems when it comes to linear functions and creating equations with it. So there's a couple things to remember about linear functions before we can create an equation with it, and that is that when you're looking at a linear function or a picture of a linear function that looks like this, right? Then the independent variable, what is referred to as the independent variable, is the x values of that function. So it's the x values, it's also called the input. So independent variable input, they both start with in is how you can remember that. And then the y values are known as the dependent variable, and those are called the output. So those are the y values. And then that is also called the output or the result of an equation. So when you're looking at an equation like this, t equals 80 minus 2m, you will find that the input of this equation, or the independent variable of this equation, is the m, the variable m, because that's what you're going to be inputting values in to get the result of this equation, which in this case would be t. So the variable that we're using is t, or the variables that we're using are t and m. But you may also notice that when we are talking about linear functions, all linear functions are written in this form, y equals mx plus b. And all we are doing is this equation looks like that form, but really what we're doing is we're replacing y with t, and we're replacing x with the m. So we're using different variables other than y and x, but we're still making the equation look like y equals mx plus b because that's the equation of a linear function, okay? So from there, since m refers to x and t refers to y, then we can identify the slope and the y-intercept as well, the m and the b. So the slope in this equation is what is next to the variable or the input, the independent variable, and that's 2. So our slope in this equation would be 2. So you'd say m is 2. Now remember, slope is what is doing the changing. So whenever we're trying to find slope in a word problem, we're going to find where the change is happening, where there is change happening, okay? And then the y-intercept is what is left. The b in this equation would be the 80. And it's important to remember also that the b is the starting point. It's the y-intercept in the equation, but it is the starting point when you're looking at it in a word problem, okay? So b is always the starting point. So using these same colors, we're going to try to write an equation based on the first example, the word problem that they give us. Okay, so remember, we're still always putting it in y equals mx plus b, but we're going to use different variables for it. So first, let's identify what the b is and what the m is, so the slope and the y-intercept. So it says a construction crew is lengthening a road. The road started with a length of 53 miles. Well, the y-intercept is always referring to what it starts. It's the starting point. So our starting point for this equation is 53. So that is going to be our b. So our b is 53. We know that. Then it says, and the crew is adding 4 miles to the road each day. Well, this is the changing that is happening because they are adding, that is a change, 4 miles to the road each day. So that is telling us that 4 must be the slope in our equation. That must be the slope in y equals mx plus b. Then it says, let L represent the total length of the road and let D represent the number of days the crew has worked. Now, an important thing to remember when you're trying to figure out what letters to use for y and x, okay, the dependent variable, so the output, the y, is always going to be the letter that represents total. So in this case, our y in our equation is going to be L because it represents total, okay? And then the other variable is obviously going to represent the input or the independent variable. So D is going to be our X. So now it asks you to write an equation. So we say L equals, we started with 53 days. Oh, actually, sorry. L equals, the slope is 4 days, D for days, plus an additional 53, which is our B. And it's in y equals mx plus b form, but it uses different letters here. So we wrote our equation, and then the last thing that they want us to do is they want to know the total length of the road after the crew has worked 32 days. So what we're going to do is we're going to plug 32 in for D. So if we do that, we get L equals 4 times 32 plus 53. And if you do 4 times 32, you get 128 plus another 53 is a total of 181 miles. Okay, so we set up our equation to match what they were in the word problem. We found the B, we found the slope, and we figured out which one was the independent and the dependent variable. Okay, so the more that you do these problems, the better you'll get at them. So let's look at the next example. Okay, so we have that the sugar sweet company is going to transport its sugar to the market. It will cost $7,500 to rent trucks, and it will cost an additional $150 for each ton of sugar transported. Now we have to figure out which one of those represents the starting point and which one of those represents the change or the slope. Well, I know that it says it will cost an additional $150 there. That is a change because it's an additional $150 for each ton of sugar, so that must be the slope. Okay. And then the other one is what it costs at the beginning, so that must be our y-intercept or our b in our equation. And then it says let C represent the total, so I know right off the back that C must be my y because it represents the total. And I know that S must be my X value when I write my equation. So again, remember your equation should look like y equals mx plus b, but you're using different variables. So let's write our equation from here. C is equal to, the slope is 150. The other variable that we're using is S for sugar plus 7,500. There is our equation. Then it asks us to figure out or to find the total cost to transport 17 tons of sugar. So we're going to plug 17 in for S and solve. So we have C equals 150 times 17 plus 7,500, and 150 times 17 is 2,550 plus 7,500 is $10,050. Okay, so let's try a couple more practice problems. In the next set of practice problems, they're not only asking us to write an equation, but they're also asking us to graph the equation afterwards. And I'll show you how that works. So we're still looking for the same things. We still want it to be in the form y equals mx plus b, okay? But we're still looking for a slope, and we're still looking for a y-intercept or a starting point. So if we look at the words, it says owners of a recreation area are filling a small pond with water. They are adding a water at a rate of 30 liters per minute. So since they are adding and they're doing some sort of change, that must be my slope. And there are 500 liters in the pond to start. Well, since it's starting out at 500 liters to begin with and not at 0, that must be my starting point. That's going to be my B. Then it says let W represent the amount of water in the pond. Well, the total amount of water in the pond must be my dependent variable or my y. And let T represent the number of minutes. So that must be my independent. So then we go to make our equation from here. Our total amount is W, or represents W, the Y, is equal to, the slope is 30, T plus, we started with 500 liters in the pond. There is our equation. So now that we found our equation, in order to graph this, what we're going to do is we're just going to create a small little XY chart here, okay? And we're just going to pick a couple points for X. Let's use 0 and 2, and we're going to plug those in for my T, okay? So if you really want, you can make the chart look like X represents T and Y represents W, so that you know where to plug it in to what. So I'm going to take those two values and plug them in. So I have W equals 30 times 0 plus 500. So 30 times 0 is just 0, so my answer there is 500. So my first point that I'm going to plot is 0, 500. So on my graph, I'm going to go 0, 500, and I'm going to plot a dot there, okay? Then we're going to plug in 2. So we have W equals 30 times 2 plus 500. Well, 30 times 2 is 60 plus 500, and that is 560. So I'm going to put that here. So I know my other point that I'm going to plot is 2 and 560. So I'm going to take a guess here about where 560 is, a little over the halfway, and I'm going to plot a dot there. And you only need 2 dots to make a line. So now you can make your line. Okay, and that's it. So you have to write an equation, and then you have to graph an equation. So let's try one more example down here. All right, in this example, again, we have to identify the slope and the y-intercept and then figure out which one is our independent and dependent variable. So in this one, it says the sugar sweet company is going to transport its sugar to the market. It will cost $45.50 to rent trucks, and it will cost an additional $175 for each ton of sugar. So since we see the additional part here, I know that that must be my slope. And I know that we start by renting trucks, so this must be my y-intercept, my starting point. Okay, and then it says let C represent the total, so I know that that one must be my y value, and S represents the amount of sugar, that must be my x value. So we go to write our equation. C is equal to, the slope is 175, S plus 45.50. Okay, so here's our equation already written, and now we got to plot it. So again, we're going to set up a little t-chart. Since S represents my x, I'm going to put S on this side and C on this side. And I'm just going to use the same points of 0, 2. So if I plug in 0, I've got C equals 175 times 0 plus 4,550. And that's just 0. So it's 4,550 is our first one. So you can go ahead and plot that on the graph, 0, 4,550. So that's about right here on your graph. And then let's plug in 2 and see what we get. So we have C equals 175 times 2 plus 4,550. So 175 times 2 is 350 plus 4,550 is 4,900. So 4,900 is where we're going to plot. So I'm going to go onto my graph and go over 2 and then go up to 4,900, which is just going to be right below that 5,000 mark. And then I'm going to make my line. Okay? So remember, you have to identify the slope, you have to identify the y-intercept, and then you have to figure out which one is the independent variable or the input and which one's the dependent variable. And make sure you're writing them always y equals mx plus b. Let me know if you have any questions on it. You can try the practice problems on Alex. Good luck.